Go ahead.
You point out in your talk that there are quite a lot of dichotomies when general discourses talk about agricultural change in Africa. So these, for example, this idea of is a rural future smallholder based or large scale based, and doing research on that issue as well, I wonder how you can get past these dichotomies. That is quite difficult to conceptualize agricultural change without these sort of dichotomies. And I'm also wondering how you can conceptualize of the state and actually as a political driver of agricultural changes with increasing investments. If you conduct research.
Didn't quite catch that last
how you can conceptualize of how you can frame the state, because you mentioned that there's not a lot of discussion of the politics in agricultural change in Africa, and I'm wondering why there is a lack of analysis of the state and how you can actually conceptualize the state when you conduct research on it.
You don't know this well, but Jonah's doing work on land grabs in Ethiopia for his PhD research. So that's kind of the underpinning context.
Do I answer that one?
Well, how do you want to do this? We can take a few more and then...
yeah, I mean, if there are more, I'll...
Okay, we'll put a few more on the table. We'll give a little note here of the questions as they come in. Yes, Felipe.
You work in Africa and also in Latin America, and I was wondering how you see like this migration of modern farmers from US to South America, especially to Brazil and Argentina, and from Brazil to Mozambique. Do they bring technology or, I don't know, forms of institutional arrangements to legitimize this so-called modernization?
Okay. Let's have one more. Yes, Peggy.
So when you started the presentation, you started with Esther Bozer, and one of the criticisms you mentioned was that she conceptualized the population undifferentiated primarily. But her later work, this is going to be a long introduction, on women in development, she does classify farming systems based on gender roles. That brings me to the curious absence of gender in this whole presentation, because, for instance, when you mention the economic dynamics of land struggles, there's a lot of evidence that I'm sure you're familiar with that suggests when a new economic opportunity comes up, there's a struggle for women's plots inside the household from men, and also women's labor. So this is kind of a two-way question, not a question, but kind of a demand that you talk more about the intra-household struggles for land, and how struggles for land goes parallel to struggles for labor, agricultural labor.
Okay, thanks very much. Thank you. All right.
That's a very interesting question. Okay, I'll leave that one for last, if that's okay. Alternatives to dichotomy in terms of small scale and large scale. I mean, I think one of the things that I would point out, and indeed I'll put up accumulation from below, rural socioeconomic differentiation, I kind of skipped across that, but I think, you know, one of the problems with the smallholder model is that it assumes that all smallholders can benefit equally from change. And I think that it's quite hard to find that in practice. I mean, if you look at Green Revolution, if you look at the Machakos case, you know, which again was regarded as being, you know, hailed as being a success for the population growing but overcoming erosion and erosion risks. In those cases, invariably you find that there are some households better, some groups end up better off than others. I mean, in the Machakos case, essentially the capacity to invest in terracing, which was the way of beating erosion, was very much dependent on having access to non-farm income. Generally, people who were working in Nairobi down the road, those earnings were coming back and were funded, or basically paying people to do the terracing. If you didn't have that money, you didn't do the terracing, you couldn't increase your productivity. Many of those people ended up selling their land to their neighbours. Okay, so, you know, differentiation is part of the process of success in that sense. Accumulation from below tends to produce winners and losers. And this is one of the problems of people, of organisations like IFAD, it seems to me, which in a sense find it very, very hard to deal with change, let's say technological change, improving productivity, as also including processes of social change. There is a sense that the rural society of small-scale farmers will remain the same, even if it's successfully increasing productivity. And I think that's just, it's very hard to find that in practice. So I think when you say, you know, how do you get away from the dichotomy? Well, first of all, you have to question the nature of those dichotomous positions. I think equally, one could look at large-scale farming and you can say, well, okay, but what is really going on in this large-scale situation? How much labour is being recruited? And what is that labour? Is it coming from somewhere else? Is it local people? If so, what effect does it have on the local economy? Does it mean that people who earn wages on large farms end up hiring people to do their farming on the small farm? I mean, there are relationships here, which I think are, you know, it's important to look at. So, I mean, to get away from the dichotomy, I would always say, look empirically at what whether those dichotomous positions actually stand up, because you know, invariably they don't. I think that's one thing. Conceptualizing the state. I mean, I think it's interesting because again, it's not done very often in my experience. I think, again, the state is not generally a monolith. There are different agencies, there are different ministries. Often policies will be driven more by particular interests within the state. The state will be responding to and will be influenced by particular interests rather more than others. So again, you need to try and trace back what are the parties involved in any particular policy, and it may not be that it's the state as a uniform entity. It could be the state in alliance, particular government agencies in alliance with particular commercial interests, for example. It may even be particular local government agencies in alliance with particular local economic interests as well. So again, I think you just have to try and disaggregate these things rather than treat the state as a sort of a monolith. Expatriate farmers, do they legitimise modernisation? Again, very interesting. I mean, I'm not sure how far... I mean, the Argentinian case, I'm not I don't really know about US farmers in Latin America. As far as I could understand, it was mostly Latin Americans who were actually running the modernization of Latin America, but maybe that's wrong. Certainly in Brazil, it seems to be mostly Brazilians who are running the big farms, places like Mato Grosso, for example. Sorry?
Like Magic, the biggest soybean farm. Yeah, but no, there is lots of American farmers. They moved to Brazil, especially to this. Hatch has a nice problem.
Okay, what I would say more, sort of closer to what I'm familiar with, is, for example, the impact of Brazilians in Africa. I'm kind of curious to see how this is going to work out. There's certainly been efforts by South Africans to move north, if you like, into other parts of Africa. There have been some spectacular failures. South Africans moved into Niassa province in Mozambique, which was considered to be empty, and indeed it was empty, and that's why they failed, because there was no infrastructure. I mean, running mechanised farms means good infrastructure. You need good access to spare parts, fuel, all these kinds of things. I mean, you need a supply chain. The supply chain's not there, it's very expensive, because you have to pay the cost of bringing all that stuff, and it has to be there at the right time. You've got to fly things in, because you've got a piece of machinery broken down. It's going to be very expensive. So, I mean, I question really whether people have done their sums and where this infrastructural underpinning is going to come from. The Brazilian case in Mozambique is particularly curious because there's a lot of talk about recreating the Cerrado in the north of Mozambique, growing soybeans basically, wall to wall. The only difference is the Cerrado was empty. There were very few people there when Brasilia was built. And they could open up a frontier of settlement and farming. In northern Mozambique, there is one of the most densely populated farming areas of the country. And there must be, I think, on the order of 10 million people or thereabouts. And the question is, where are the farms going to go? And is this going to be a real big issue of displacement of people? So, I mean, certainly one could say that technically there are some modernisation possibilities, but in political terms, I have some severe worries about what they're going to try and do there. Maybe different in places like the Congo, I don't know. But there is always the question of people and displacement. Those are up, and gender differentiation. Yeah.